Well, we are going to jump right in here, family. We've got some ground to cover. So if you got a copy of your scriptures, we're in Daniel chapter 11, and I'm going to read to you starting in verse 1 that says this: "And as for me, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood up to confirm and strengthen him." So we're jumping in mid-conversation here, and if you recall from last week, an angel had visited the prophet Daniel and said to him, "I'm about to give you a vision." Daniel is part of the people of God in the Old Testament, who in this moment were living in a time of exile. For review, you can see it here on a map. If you go all the way back to the first book of the Bible, Genesis, in Genesis chapter 12, God told one man, Abraham, "I'm going to move you to this little piece of real estate that the prophet Ezekiel called the navel of the earth, with nations all around her." And he says, "From that spot, I'm going to bless you and make you a blessing to every family on the earth." And then God made a covenant with the children of Abraham and said, "If you walk in my ways, I will use you as my PR agents to the world, to let the world know what it is to know God and to walk with me." And much of the Old Testament is the unfolding tragedy of people who know what it is to walk with God, refusing to do so. And so God warns them over and over again, "If you persist in disobedience, I will cast you out." They did, and he did. And so for 70 years, they lost their sovereignty as a nation and were under foreign domination, all the way back from where Abraham started, first under the empire of Babylon and then under Persia. And then now in our text, in the first year of Darius, they were allowed to go home. And here, I don't know if you caught this was an angel speaking. The angel just told Daniel, "And I was there, and I helped Darius get the strength to pull that off," right? And then the angel says in verse 2, "And now I will show you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and a 4th shall be far richer than all of them. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece." If you recall from last week, when this vision started, Daniel stayed in Persia at this point because he's old. But the exiles went back and began to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple, and I think Daniel was hoping that they would go back and live happily ever after, and the credits would roll. But he discovered when they got there, they met great persecution and conflict. And so we saw last week, he was praying and mourning and grieving, saying, and this angel showed up to reveal to him last week, "Hey, Daniel, there's a spiritual battle happening right behind the scenes of your political and your personal struggles." And yet here Daniel is wrestling, like many of us do, with questions like, "But God, why is it so hard? God, in the midst of difficulty, are you still in control? Are you still good? Are you still worthy of trust? Are we on the rails, or are we just floating in space somewhere? God, what on earth are you doing, for heaven's sake?" And here in this moment, the angel will say, in response to your prayers, "I'm going to show you the truth." And what follows in Daniel chapter 11 is a selective yet very detailed overview of the flow of history from the time of Daniel in the 5th century or 6th century BC to the very end of the world in the Antichrist. All right? And it will be so precise that some scholars will say this can't be real. This has to be prophecy after the fact, because there's no way Daniel could know that. And yet we believe what the prophet Isaiah said in chapter 46. God says through Isaiah 46:8, "Remember this and stand firm. Recall it to mind, you transgressors. Remember the former things of old. For I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand and I will accomplish all my purpose." Why is God about to give us this prophecy that we're about to read? Well, he said it through Isaiah, so that you will remember and stand firm. Prophecy is for perseverance. That God gives prophecy to his people when they're in the midst of difficulty, and it's so that they can endure. That for the sake of your endurance, let me show you that I have not lost my grip on the wheel of history. And so when you're in the midst of pain, you may not understand all that I'm doing, but you know that I'm in control, and so you won't lose heart. I remember for me, years ago, I was at a camp, and a buddy of mine and I, we were leaving the dorms And as we entered the entryway, there was a dove in the corner attempting to fly into the sky, but he didn't understand glass and how it worked. And so this dove was just banging against this glass, confused on why he couldn't get himself free. And I felt a great surge of compassion for him. And so I decided in my benevolence to scoop him up in my loving hands and walk him to the door and set him free. And so as I went down to gingerly pick up this dove, he began to peck at me and scratch me, and he just didn't understand what grace looked like, right? And so my friend, after my failure, I remember he went and grabbed a rug, and he picked it up, and he just pinned the dove against the window, and then he rolled the rug into a cylinder, sort of trapping this dove in a cylinder of darkness, so that all that the dove could see was blackness and my friend Chris's face. And then Chris walked him over to the door, and this dove's freaking out. And then at a given moment, he just unrolled the rug, and this dove flew free into the sky and was gone. Now, I don't know if doves reflect on their life and learn lessons. I don't know. But in that moment, that dove may have thought, you know what? I didn't understand what was happening in the dark, but all I understand is now that I'm free. And I don't know if he'll ever get himself stuck again, but if he did, he may not trust me. But if he ever saw my buddy Chris again, he might say, you know what? That guy wrapped me in darkness. And I don't know why he did it that way, and I don't know why it persisted so long. But he ultimately set me free. And so if I see his face at the top of that cylinder, I'll trust him, even in the dark, right? That's what's happening in Daniel 11. Hey, I am leading you through history. You may not understand the dark, and you certainly may not like it, but I'm gonna show you that I have not lost my grip on the wheel, so you can trust my face when you can't understand the tracing of my hand. Do you see it, family? All right, so let's jump in. Verse 2, now I'll show you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and a 4th shall be far richer than all of them. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. He tells him, you got more time under Persia, Daniel, 3 more kings. Which incidentally is exactly what happened. I've got those 3 kings' names right here, but they're all very hard to pronounce, so I'll skip it. But indeed, a 4th king did arise, and he was richer and stronger than them, and he did pick a fight against Greece. His name was Xerxes, and he ruled from 485 to 465 BC. You can read about him in the book of Esther. And when he became strong, he harassed Greece, which made them very mad. Now, let me make a note here. Daniel is having this conversation in 536 BC. And the angel just showed him what was going to happen in 464 BC. So we're at verse number 2, and we just made it through 72 years into the future. That would be like a prophet showing up to Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1953 and telling him the results of the election in 2024. And he's like, I'm just trying to make it through the Cold War. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the future. Write this down. Verse 3, then a mighty king shall arise who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills. And as soon as he's arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided to the 4 winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the authority with which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to the others besides these. This all happened. The mighty king in verse 3 is Alexander the Great. We talked about him. He's shown up a lot in the book of Daniel. His rise was foreshadowed all the way back in chapter 2, the bronze belly of the great statue that was depicting the nations that King Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream. We talked about him in chapter 7. He was pictured as the winged leopard. And in chapter 8, he was the prominent horn of the goat, that the Bible talked about this. Xerxes harassed Greece, and it left an indelible mark on young Alex. And so as he grew up into adulthood, he vowed revenge. And so when he came to power, he did everything Daniel just prophesied. He ruled with great dominion and did as he willed. He conquered from Greece all the way to India. And as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom was broken. That happened. He died at age 32. And he had no heir to take his place, or as Daniel prophesied, no posterity. And so his kingdom was divided among his 4 generals, none of which were as powerful as him. The angel just told Daniel everything that was about to happen. Now, this is worth noting here too. There are several other lesser Persian kings that will pass by without mention because we don't care about them anymore. As soon as he brings up Greece, he moves to talk about Greece's empire. Why? Because Daniel was concerned about the people of God. God told these people, I'm going to put you in this land and bless you, and through you bless the whole world. And Daniel's wondering, are we still on the plan or did we lose it? And so he's like, no, I am following you. And he's showing him, hey, you know what? I'm going to move your people back to the land, right? I will put you back. in that promised land, but it won't be easy, Daniel. I will fulfill my purposes, but you will struggle under Persia, then under Greece. God is faithful, but the world is fallen, and I'm calling you to endure. And we've talked about this earlier. These four rulers that followed Alexander, you can read in history books who they were. Seleucus, who oversaw Babylonia and Syria. Ptolemy over Egypt. Lysimachus over Asia Minor. And Cassander over Macedonia and Greece. We talked about them before. They were pictured as the four heads of the leopard in chapter 7 and the four horns of the goat in chapter 8. Now, let me pause again right here. Daniel's at 536 BC. This angel just told him what was going to happen in 323 BC. That's 213 years down the corridors of time Daniel just looked. That would be like an angel showing up to James Madison at the War of 1812 and telling him that the President of the United States will one day subsidize the electric car. And Madison would say, wait a minute, what is a car, right? But that's what he just did. Now, for the next 15 verses, Daniel is going to record prophecies concerning the kings of Egypt and the kings of Syria. Two of the four kingdoms that came from Alexander's empire were called the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids, who were in Syria. They're called the kingdom of the south and the kingdom of the north because they surround the nation of Israel. Remember, we're concerned about the people of God that he put in this little piece of real estate. So the Ptolemies are the kings of the south, and the Seleucids are the kings of the north, right? Because they're north and south of Israel. Now, for the next 7 minutes, you don't have to take any notes, okay? I'm just gonna do this very fast. Sit back and enjoy the ride. You will probably never hear this passage preached again, church. I'm certainly never gonna preach it again, Lord willing. It's strange, not strange because it's difficult philosophically, theologically, or even prophetically, but because it's so comprehensive. And so you don't need to remember all these details, but I just want you to notice, as Daniel's struggling, God, are you in control? Notice the level of detail God gives him about things to come. Give me 7 minutes. Verse 5. Then the king of the south shall be strong, but one of his princes shall be stronger than he and shall rule, and his authority shall be a great authority. That happened. The strong king of the south was Ptolemy I, a very capable general underneath Alexander, and was given authority over Egypt. One of his princes who became stronger than him and ruled was Seleucus. And you go, wait a minute, I thought he was already ruling. Well, he was, but a lesser general drove him out of Babylon, so he went and worked for Ptolemy as one of his princes. But then when that general died, Seleucus went back to take over, had a much larger area of real estate, and grew in power so that the Seleucids became even more powerful than the Ptolemies. This gets us down to 305 BC, 231 years into the future for Daniel. This would be like telling George Washington about AI on our smartphones. Verse 6, after some years they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the strength of her arm, and he and his arm shall not endure. But she shall be given up, and her attendants, he who fathered her, and he who supported her in those times. This happened. It's actually a very crazy story. In 250 BC, Ptolemy II, the king of the south, attempted to make peace with Antiochus II, the king of the north. And he did it by sending his daughter, Bernice, to marry the king of the north. That was his plan. The daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement, is the way Daniel prophesies it. Ptolemy was down with it. It was his idea. Antiochus was down with it. He wanted to marry her. Bernice was okay with it. It all seemed good. There was just one problem. Antiochus was already married, and his wife didn't like this idea. And so she poisoned Bernice and her husband, killed them both. And so the daughter of the king of the south did not retain her strength. The king of the north didn't endure. And then Bernice's dad died that same year. It's very sad. All this 200 years after this prophecy from Daniel. And verse 7, and from a branch from her roots, one shall arise in his place. He shall come against the army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he shall deal with them and shall prevail. He shall also carry off to Egypt their gods and their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold. And for some years he shall refrain from attacking the king of the north. Then later they shall come to the realm of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land. All this happened. After Ptolemy II died, Bernici's brother, Ptolemy number 3, they weren't real creative with names, a branch from her roots is what Daniel calls him. He rose, and to retaliate for his sister's death, he attacked the Seleucid kingdom in the north and was very successful, entered the fortress of their capital city, and famously took away their gods and their precious gold and silver. The king of the north attempted to retaliate and was unsuccessful, but in verse 10, his sons shall wage war and assemble a multitude of great forces, which shall keep coming and overflow and pass through, and again shall carry the war as far as the fortress. This happened. The two sons of Seleucus number 2, Seleucus number 3, and Antiochus number 3, again, not creative, sought to restore their kingdom to its former glory by expanding with military conquest. And Antiochus number 3 went south to Egypt, down to their fortress in Raphia, the southwest of Gaza. And again, Daniel's learning all this because these kingdoms are fighting out, and Israel is sort of the political football that keeps moving between these allegiances of these two cities. God will take care of you. You will endure, Daniel, but it will be harder than you think, right? And your troubles aren't over. So now we're in 219 BC, 317 years into Daniel's future. This would be like telling Queen Anne in the 1700s that TikTok will be the leading app among teens. Verse 11, then the king of the south, moved with rage, shall come out and fight against the king of the north, and he shall raise a great multitude, but it shall be given into his hand. And when that multitude is taken away, his heart shall be exalted, and he shall cast down tens of thousands, but he shall not prevail. For the king of the north shall again raise a multitude greater than the first, and after some years he shall come on with a great army and abundant supplies. All this happened. The king of the south here is Ptolemy number 4, and after he was driven back by Antiochus number 3, he retaliated by coming out to fight, and he cast down tens of thousands, but he wasn't able to prevail. So he went back down, and Antiochus number 3 came down after a few years, 15 exactly, and attacked and turned back the king of the south. And at this point, the Ptolemies begin to weaken, and the Seleucid kingdom becomes increasingly dominant. So much so that in verse 14, in those times, many shall rise against the king of the south. And the violent among your own people shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they shall fail. After Ptolemy 4 came Ptolemy 5, and as he was young, there was some instability, and so many did rise up against the king of the south, and many of your own people, Daniel, meaning Jews, decided we don't like all the taxation from the Egyptians, so they attempted to rebel, but were not successful. But in verse 15, then the king of the north shall come and throw up siege works and take a well-fortified city, and the force of the south shall not stand, or even his best troops, for there shall be no strength to stand. But he who comes against him shall do as he wills, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his hand. Antiochus III, the king of the north, will fight against the south in 198 BC, and the Egyptians will surrender at their fortress in Sidon. And then Antiochus III will enter what's called here the glorious land, this piece of real estate God cares about. And now the Seleucids will rule this land and rule over God's people until the arrival of Rome. We are now 338 years into Daniel's future. This would be like telling Sir Isaac Newton about Elon Musk. Right? Verse 17, he shall set his face to come with the strength of his whole kingdom, and he shall bring terms of an agreement and perform them. He shall give him the daughter of women to destroy the kingdom, but it shall not stand or be to his advantage. This happened. This is actually really fascinating. Antiochus III decided, I want to try to make an allegiance with the king of the south, and so he sent his daughter Cleopatra to marry the King Ptolemy. But he thought, when I send Cleopatra, she'll kind of work for her dad and give me control over Egypt. But she ended up siding with her husband against her dad. So as Daniel said it did not work to his advantage, which was a real bummer. So in verse 18, afterwards he shall turn his face to the coastlands. He said, if I can't have Egypt, I'm going somewhere else. And he shall capture many of them. But a commander shall put an end to his insolence. Indeed, he shall turn his insolence back upon him. Then he shall turn his face back toward the fortress of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and shall not be found. Antiochus III did turn towards the coastlands, namely Asia Minor and Greece. However, a commander did shut him down, a commander, incidentally, from the rising power in the west called Rome. So we just went from Babylon to Persia to Greece. Now the Romans are coming. And they defeated Antiochus III, took much of his territory, took much of his military force, took hostages, including his own son, and then made him pay heavy tribute. And so he had to raise taxes, and he did it by plundering temples. And so this passage says he stumbled and fell and was not found. Famously, he was plundering a temple, and they killed him while he was doing it. Verse 20, then shall arise in his place one who shall send an exactor of tribute for the glory of the kingdom, but within a few days he shall be broken, neither in anger nor in battle. This is a crazy story. Antiochus III was replaced by Seleucus IV, who succeeded him, and he did hire a tax collector, an exactor of tribute named Heliodorus. And he told him, hey, you go get money from these temples. But within a few days, the king was broken, neither in anger nor in battle, meaning he wasn't killed in an angry mob like his dad. He didn't die in battle either. Actually, he was poisoned by his tax collector, Heliodorus. Crazy story. We don't have time to go into it all. But again, now we're 370 years into Daniel's future. This would be like telling Oliver Cromwell about Taylor Swift, all right? And it's at this point the story slows down. So we made it. Everybody okay? That was 7 minutes. All right. Donna told me not to do that, but we made it. It's all right. It's all right. Okay. Anyway, it slows down here because we're going to get to one guy that gets more attention than all the rest of these kings combined. He's called Antiochus IV. He called himself Antiochus Epiphanes, the appearance of glory. They will call him Antiochus Epiphanes, the madman. And he will get more attention than any of these other kings. Why? All this was a setup to get his people to this moment. Daniel, a king is going to come, and you've talked about him before. He was called the little horn in Daniel chapter 8. And he will unleash a persecution on the people of God such that they've never seen. He will attempt to eradicate the worship of the one true God. And we saw in chapter 7, he is the foreshadow of an apocalyptic ruler who will desecrate the holy place and persecutes God's people. So it's Christmas. We're about to celebrate the birth of Jesus in the coming weeks. But before that, we are going to talk about the Antichrist. Buckle up. Here he is. Verse 21, this is a picture of him in this king Antiochus. Verse 21, in his place shall arise a contemptible person to whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Seleucus IV's son Demetrius was supposed to be king, but he was captive in Rome. So Antiochus, his uncle, took the throne even though royal majesty had not been given to him. And then he paid off important people with flattery in order to seal his position. That's true. Verse 22, armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the prince of the covenant. And from the time that an alliance is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, and he shall become strong with the small people. Antiochus was accepted even though he was a usurper because he was able to overcome armies, specifically Ptolemy in the south. He even took him hostage. And Antiochus gained prestige and power even though he had a small number of followers through what the text calls here intrigue. He's a liar. He's deceitful. In verse 24, without warning, he shall come into the richest parts of the province, and he shall do what neither his father nor his father's fathers have done, scattering among them plunder, spoil, and goods. He shall devise plans against strongholds, but only for a time. Antiochus Epiphanes did this. He did what no other Seleucid before could do. He walked into Egypt. He took over even the nation of Israel, and he plundered their richest parts. How did he do it? Through deception. And he did it by dividing their plunder and giving it to those who were in allegiance with him. But notice, this is the first time, it'll actually show up many times later. He could only do this for a time. This evil man will be given power, and yet that power is limited by God. Verse 25, and he shall stir up his power in his heart against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall wage war with an exceedingly great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for plots shall be devised against him. Even those who eat his food shall break him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. And as for the two kings, their heart shall be bent on doing evil. They shall speak lies at the same table, but to no avail, for the end is yet to be at the time appointed. I'll just summarize here. This is talking about Antiochus Epiphanes when he fights the king of the south. He wins, takes Ptolemy captive, but then they begin to plot together, and he helps Ptolemy take back over the kingdom from his brother. And they have an alliance, but as they sit at the table, they're both lying to each other. Antiochus just wants control. Ptolemy ends up building an alliance with his brother against him. It's all deceit and lies. Verse 28, and he shall return to his land with great wealth. But his heart shall be set against the holy covenant, and he shall work his will and return to his own land. This happened. When Antiochus left Egypt in 169 BC, he was passing back through the land of Israel, where these people have been replanted and are worshiping the one true God. And in that place, he sees that they were resisting his plans to Hellenize them, make them Greek, and eradicate their religion. They didn't want to be what he was trying to make them to be. And so he set his heart against the Holy Covenant. At this point, when he came back and saw that they weren't getting in line with his program, he killed thousands of men and carried men and children away in slavery and then plundered their temple. Verse 29, and at the time appointed he shall return and come into the south, but it shall not be this time as it was before. For ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdraw, and shall turn back and be enraged, and take action against the holy covenant. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the holy covenant. We actually talked about this before. He went back to fight the king of the south, but it wasn't at the times as before because the ships of Kittim were there. The ships of Kittim came from the west, and they were carrying Romans. And remember, we told this story. Antiochus went down to eradicate the south. When he showed up, there was a contingent of Romans there. And a representative from the Roman Senate said, hey, if you cross this line, you declare war, not just with Ptolemy, you declare war with Rome. You ready to do that? You want that smoke? And Antiochus said, let me think about it. And then famously, the Roman representative drew a circle around Antiochus in the sand. He was the first circle maker. And he drew a line in the sand. That's where that comes from. And he said, you step out of that circle without making a decision. You declare war on Rome. And he humiliated Antiochus. And Antiochus backed off. He's like, I can't face Rome. And so he walked away humiliated. And as he did so, he had to walk back through through Israel. And like people who are mad will come home and yell at their cat or kick the dog, he attacks the people of God. Verse 31. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. For the second time, he takes out his frustrations on the people of God. He takes away their burnt offerings. No more worship of God. Takes away their religious practices. No more festivals. You can't circumcise your kids or I'll kill you and the mom. He began to burn the Torah. I will eradicate your very inspired word of God. No more prophets. And he rewarded those who violated that covenant. And then it says he set up the abomination that causes desolation. We know when he did it. It was actually this week, December 15th in 167 BC. He set up an altar to Zeus in the temple to Yahweh, and he offered a pig on that altar and defiled the temple. What's called here, the abomination that makes desolate. Verse 33, and the wise among the people shall make many understand, though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. When they stumble, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join themselves to them with flattery. And some of the wise will stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made white until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time. The wise are those who fear God and refuse to submit to this attempted annihilation of their faith. He says they'll make many understand. They will help some people go, hey, this is important. We have to remain faithful even if we have to take a hit, and they will suffer, stumble and fall by sword and flame. They'll get a little help, which we did a couple sermons ago. It was called the Maccabean Revolt, right? And some will join that revolt. A fight will break out that ends in the cleansing of the temple. It's celebrated this month called Hanukkah. But he said in the midst of this persecution, some will suffer and die. Some will be refined and purified and made white. Not white like, don't think ethnically. It's pure or clean. God will allow pain on your people, Daniel. But that pain and persecution will be a tool to refine you. So here, did you notice at the end, he says, this will happen until the times of the end, and it still awaits the appointed time. There's an interesting shift here for the last few minutes we have together. Daniel starts talking about something else. Until the times of the end, it awaits for the appointed time. The angel's letting you know, Daniel, your nation will not have the autonomy it once did under King David and the like. It will be under Gentile domination, and this will continue, and you will have to endure all the way to the end. And right here at verse 36, it's like the angel lifts off. And for the rest of the verses, he's not talking with this precision about Ptolemies and Seleucids anymore. He starts talking about a different kind of king. And he does what you often see in prophecies. They'll start talking about something, and then it'll elevate, and you go, I don't think we're talking quite about the same thing. We talked about this spiritually, that there's passages in the Old Testament that are talking about the king of Tyre and the king of Babylon, but then it starts to talking about, oh, you morning star who fell from heaven because of your pride. And you realize we're talking about the spiritual forces behind these earthly kings. These are the passages that tell us about the origin of the devil. And here in this passage, you'll see what happens as he begins to talk about what's happening in Antiochus, but he says, you are a pattern and a picture of what's to come. What you did back then will be repeated again in a larger and more fulfilling way later, right? God knows the end from the beginning, and what we're about to see is going towards the end. And so in the verses that follow here, you see predictive pattern. Antiochus is a picture of a ruler's to come. But there's also more here than just a pattern. What we're going to see in these verses, sometimes people talk about prophetic literature as if they're in a mountain range. I don't know if you've ever been to the mountains and you're looking and you see two mountain peaks and they look like they're right next to each other. And so you go, oh, let's hike up to that one. And you hike up to this one and you realize, oh, I thought they were neighbors. There's a whole valley between. You see often in prophetic literature, they'll talk about days of struggle and then God blessing them. And they'll talk about it and realize, hey, some of this will be fulfilled in a near way. Some of it's going to be fulfilled in a far way. There's a distance you don't expect. The most famous one is the arrival of Jesus. Many people thought when the Messiah comes, everything's going to be wrapped up and fine. And Jesus has to explain, no, do you remember from Daniel? The Son of Man's coming, and then he must be cut off. And then the Son of Man will come in glory with his holy angels, right? These two mountains that look close are actually further apart. And we live between those two mountains. Do you see it? That's what's about to happen in this passage. That he was talking about Antiochus. Now we're talking about who Antiochus represents, somebody else. What John will call the Antichrist. Now, some of you may hear this and go, Ben, are you just making that up? Like, where are you getting that from? That suddenly we're talking about somebody else? Well, I'm not forcing this. I'm following Jesus. He's kind of my guy, right? That's my quarterback. And that's how he does this. In Matthew chapter 24, Jesus gives one of his last speeches to his disciples, and they ask him specifically, Jesus, what will be the sign of your coming? He's already there, but they're saying, what will be the sign? You said you're coming again to wrap up history. They ask him, what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And he tells them stuff that sounds a lot like Daniel. Well, there'll be deception, there'll be wars, there'll be rumors of wars, but don't be alarmed. These are just the beginning of birth pains. It's going to endure longer than you think. And he says, and there will be tribulation. You'll be put to death. There will be difficulty ahead. But then he tells them in Matthew 24:15, but when you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place. And then I love this, Matthew goes, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, Jesus lived 200 years after Antiochus Epiphanes. And Jesus says the abomination of desolation, what Antiochus did in the temple, that was small ball. That was a picture of what's coming. And Jesus says the true abomination of desolation is yet future for me. You haven't seen this yet. So he's been calling the shot of the future, that's the past for us, now showing us the future, that's the future for us. And if God's nailing all these details and hasn't missed a single one yet, you think we can trust him for what's ahead? Well, buckle up, because we're going to be looking at, in just the last few minutes here, what was called the little horn in chapter 7, the ruler in chapter 9. Revelation 13 will call him the beast. Paul will call him the man of lawlessness. John calls him the Antichrist. Merry Christmas. Verse 36. And the king shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. And he shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished, for what is decreed shall be done. He says, this ruler to come will have tremendous power. He will do what he wills. And with that power, he will say shocking things against the God of gods, and he will claim to be God himself. Like Daniel chapter 7 says, he will speak against the Most High. Now, Antiochus did this. Antiochus said, I am the Epiphanes, the appearance of glory. But this will be something else. It's interesting, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, the Apostle Paul, 2 Thessalonians is in the New Testament, after the life of Jesus. The Apostle Paul is writing a letter to the Thessalonians. They were going through persecution. And it was hard, and they were like, hey, wait a minute. I thought Jesus was going to come and it's all going to be fine. And then they got worried. Did we miss it? Like, did Jesus come in a bus and we missed the bus stop? Like, what was going on? Like, did we get left here? And Paul tells them, no. We're not at the end yet. And he says in 2 Thessalonians 2, let no one deceive you. For that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. Paul quotes Daniel here and says, we're not at the end of time yet. Why? Because we haven't seen this guy yet. When you see him, buckle up, right? And yet notice again, it says, his time has been determined. God will let evil persist, but it's limited. It will not endure forever. God rules, evil doesn't. History is not in the hands of evil men. And we saw this in Daniel 7 and Daniel 9, which I will now not read to you. All right, so verse 37. He shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers or to the one beloved by women. He shall not pay attention to any other god, for he shall magnify himself above all. He shall honor the God of fortresses instead of these, a God whom his fathers did not know, and he shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. This ruler will have no interest in religions of the past. He will have no interest in kindness or mercy. He will love power, fortresses, and money, riches. This is what's coming. Verse 39, and he shall deal with the strongest fortress with the help of a foreign god, and those who acknowledge him he shall load with honor, and he shall make the rulers over many and shall divide the land for a price. Verse 40, at the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, but the king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind, with chariots and horsemen and with many ships. He shall come into countries and shall overflow and pass through. He shall come into the glorious land, and tens of thousands shall fall, but these shall be delivered out of his hand, Edom and Moab and main parts of the Ammonites. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and of silver, and all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Cushites shall follow in his train. But news from the east and the north shall alarm him. He shall go out with great fury to destroy and devote many to destruction. And he shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end with none to help him. Let me sum up. At the time of the end, Daniel says, there will be a major battle, and armies will come from the north and from the south. And this powerful ruler will come into the glorious land that is Israel. So if you noticed those other names of nations, Africa's in the fight, Middle East is in the fight, Europe is in the fight. This is not talking about Antiochus anymore. And yet it'll all coalesce around the glorious mountain. Incidentally, Revelation 16 talks about this, the great battle at the end of days. Revelation 16:16 says, and they assembled them at the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. Har Megiddo, the mountain of Megiddo. I've actually sat there. A great battle at the end. And yet, here's where I want to end. He shall come to his end with none to help him. What's the lesson here? And we're going to close. Daniel is hoping, God, can my life just get easier, right? Like many of you pray, God, will you just show me the one and give me a lot of money? In Jesus' name, amen, right? And he starts telling you all about the Antichrist and the end of time, and you're like, that is not what I asked. That is not in my purview. Why is God doing this? Why show Daniel hundreds of years into the future? Let me sum up, and thank you for sitting through all this. God is trying to show him, Daniel, I rule over all the nations. Even when it looks like I don't, I rule the nations, okay? And my word is faithful, and my word is true, right? And yet, Daniel, suffering is coming. The world is broken, and broken things will happen. And yet I'm giving you prophecy. I tell you the future. Why? For your perseverance, so you'll endure. Christians are meant to endure. I will worship God. I will follow him. I will obey him. I will do things his way, even when it costs me. Why? Not out of gratitude primarily for the past, but because I know he's coming in the future. Jesus said it, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. How did Jesus suffer on the cross? Not out of gratitude for what his God gave him in the past, although that's true. It was because I know even through my suffering, God will redeem people from every tribe, tongue, and nation. It's a glorious future that pulls us through a difficult present. And so we say there's a God who rules over the nations, and prophecy gives me perseverance. He's right at every level. He can't miss. So I trust him even when I don't understand. And he tells you, though I am good, the world has gone wrong, and you will have to struggle through evil. You will. But I promise you, evil doesn't rule. It will get really bad. But in the end, he shall come to an end, and none will help him. Let me tell you how Jesus says that, because he will pull together a couple quotes from Daniel. In that same passage where he talks about the coming of his second coming in Matthew 24. He says in verse 21, there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now and never will be. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Paul will say it this way in 2 Thessalonians 2:8. Then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus will kill with the breath of his mouth and bring to nothing by the appearance of his coming. Jesus says a day is coming where I will come on the clouds of glory, and I will put an end to evil, and all those associated with evil will be judged. But this is not the day of judgment. These are the days of grace. And so he came first, humbly, like a baby, as a baby, lived the perfect life we could not, died on that cross. Why? To take away our sin so that he might assemble people from every tribe, tongue, and nation to be his. That's why he wanted that people on that little piece of real estate, so that right there in the center of the nations, God would offer us a way to make peace with God. Jesus Christ will come not to judge you, but to take judgment out of the way so you can be right with God. And yes, there is still pain ahead, but we can have peace. And God put him right in those nations, even in the middle of all that trouble. Why? So that in one generation, the gospel would go as far as Spain and India. And so that here, 2,000 years later, the name of Jesus is celebrated around the globe, and you didn't even know the name of Antiochus until we did this series. Evil will fall, Christ will rule. And in the end, he is coming to eradicate sin, and it will not be a fight when Jesus shows up. Did you see how he beats the Antichrist? With a breath and with his appearing. It's not a fight. Jesus wins. Let me sum up here. I had a friend the other day tell me that he really enjoys this political commentator he watches. And he says, but I got a problem, Ben. He said, I love his take. And yet whenever he gets onto this subject where I'm an expert, namely the economy, he's completely wrong. And he said, lately it started to make me nervous of going, if he's 100% wrong in the one area that I know things about, I'm starting to wonder if I can trust him in these other areas. And I said, I think your skepticism is warranted. If he's wrong in the things you can verify, don't trust the things you can't. But what did we just see in Daniel? God calls his shot for hundreds of years, which is now the past for us, so we can verify it. Did these things happen? All the way down to Bernanke. It's a stunning and tedious level of detail. And he was 100% right. So if he is right in every detail we can verify, and he says, all of you like sheep have gone astray, each his own way, but God laid on him the iniquity of us all. And by faith in Jesus, you can be saved by grace, not by works, but by trusting in him. And one day he will come again and take away every tear, dry your eye, eradicate evil, and rule forever. If he was right back then, I'm trusting him now. And though I may be wrapped in darkness and don't understand it, I trust that face. And so I am bold and I persevere because of the prophecy of my Prince.